Good afternoon or good evening, depending where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, April the 20th, 2022. So let's start with what we might call a breaking story here, and it involves Matthew Dowd, who was a former PR spiv and Republican Party hack, closely associated with George W. Bush. And then afterwards, Matthew Dowd had a road to Damascus conversion, as it were. And now he is against all of the things that he used to be for. And he is so very, very self righteous about it. He's a regular on MSNBC, and he was interviewed by Nicole Wallace, a former Republican Party hack, who is best known for leaking against her own vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin, because it appeared that Sarah Palin was outshining John McCain. It's absolutely ridiculous, of course, because the vice president doesn't count. Who cares? Okay, so Sarah Palin is getting more audience response than John McCain. Well, if you're elected president, then you can send her to cut ribbons in the middle of nowhere and to attend the funerals of dignitaries that no one has ever heard of. But this is what Matthew Dowd had to say. If Jesus Christ was alive today, he would be called a groomer, he would be called woke, and he would be called a socialist. Now, all of this is absolutely true, but it's true that it's untrue. Woke, no. If you want to follow me, follow my commandments, he said. Socialist, Jesus Christ, of course, was the man who did not denounce slavery, was the man who said that one should give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God. But a groomer, well, how about that? Because I suppose if Jesus Christ were alive today, according to Matthew Dowd, he would be telling 5-year-olds how to do disgusting things and suggesting to them they're not really boys or girls. I responded to him, but whoso shall offend one of these little ones who believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea. You are hellbound, Matthew J. Dowd. It gets better. It gets better on MSNBC. This is from Lindsay Cornick at Fox News. MSNBC's Nicole Wallace compares DeSantis Youngkin education bills to Russian soldiers raping children. Yeah, this is what we have been reduced to. Deadline White House host Nicole Wallace wholeheartedly condemned the recent education bills passed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin as dehumanization tactics Wednesday. During her NBC show, she spoke with Bulwark writer Tim Miller. Bulwark is an offshoot of the failed Weekly Standard, a magazine which, of course, was run by neocon maniacs. On recent efforts by Republicans DeSantis and Youngkin to pass parental rights in education bills in their states. Wallace went one step further to accuse the governor and others like him as using war tactics against children. A quote, I worry in covering Glenn Youngkin and his politics of parental choice, all the focus was on how well it worked. And even in our conversations about DeSantis, it's about how well they're serving him. The truth is, dehumanization as a tactic for politics is from war. Dehumanization is a tactic, speaking right now, where Russians get the soldiers to rape children by dehumanizing them. Dehumanization as a practice, as a tactic of war, it is being deployed in our politics. And people like you and I sometimes lose the plot and admire its effectiveness, not its substance, unquote. She continued, but even its analysis loses sight of what this speech brings us back to, which is dehumanization as a cost right now as it's being deployed. Chasten Butt Judge made this point when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being introduced. Kids will die. How do we bring it back to the substance of the harm that's done by any strategy in war and politics of dehumanizing people? Yeah, I think that's right, Miller replied. Their cruelty and inhuman behavior is inexcusable. Yes. So if you are not polluting the minds of 5-year-olds, if you're not filling their heads with sex, 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 and maybe you're not the sex that they told you were, then this is cruelty and inhuman behavior and inexcusable. Dowd said, this is a tactic of war. We are in a culture war. This is a culture war launched by Republicans against the country and the Democrats. Well, he's right about that. And the statements made by Matthew Dowd and Tim Miller and Nicole Wallace and others indicate that this culture war must use scorched earth tactics. These people are depraved. They are wicked. They believe in the sexual mutilation of children in myriad ways. They cannot be tolerated, not politically at any rate. And let's go to the chat. Hello to Anne Run, Dan Ellison, Don from Beyond, Dan, Palcasso88, Yo Mama, Head McNeck, David the Gnome. Anne Run says, going from W to MSNBC, isn't that Damascus-y? And Head McNeck says, looks like Gonzalo is dead. That'd be Gonzalo Lira, Chilean American who was in Kharkov reporting on what was going on in the Ukraine and angering the saintly Ukrainian authorities who have shut down every opposition newspaper in the country, who have shut down every opposition TV station in the country, but they're the ones standing for liberty and democracy. Hello to William Hicks. David the Gnome says left-wing people have the most bizarre interpretations of the Bible, which they rarely, if ever, even read, but cannot understand even if they do. I've noticed one thing going back decades about left-wing people who they carry on about Christianity as if all Christians are fundamentalists, and in fact, a small minority of Christians are fundamentalists. Let's see. Catholics aren't fundamentalists. Orthodox aren't fundamentalists. Lutherans, Anglicans aren't fundamentalists. I mean, I could go on. Most of the evangelicals are not fundamentalists, but they know so little of Christianity, particularly the way that the New Testament is meant to be, or the Old Testament rather, is meant to be interpreted in light of the New, that everything they have to say about Christianity is absolutely worthless. Hello to John S. Dan Allison says Jesus would take the whip to the Matthew Dowds of the world. That's what Jesus would or will do. Anwar says, I don't think Jesus would approve of oligarchs, though. Hello to Denny McDougall. What else do we have? Hello to Metal Mike. Will the Canadian feds ever lift the vax mandates? I'm beginning to think that they won't, for two reasons. One, spitefulness. And two, to stick it to the truckers and their supporters. And we're not like that evil Trump. Of course, the lifting of the mandates didn't happen under Trump. Trump was Mr. Vaccine and remains so. They're gloating over a jumped-up football hooligan torturing and killing Gonzalo Lira, says Chogokin 666. Yo Mama says it only became a culture war when the right refused to knuckle under and die. All right. Let's see. Let me just do a search here for Gonzalo Lira and see if I find something. One tries to say au courant. Okay, here we go. The disappearance. Oh, this is the piece of shit in Kharkov that's currently celebrating with Azov Nazis the disappearance of Gonzalo Lira and calling for Patrick Lancaster to be dealt with too. Independent journalist Gonzalo Lira is allegedly captured by NATO-backed Azov Nazis, doxxed by Daily Beast, and linked so-called journalist FBI informant Sarah Ashto Cirillo, while journalists are forbidden entry to Assange extradition hearing. Get the picture? That's from Vanessa Beasley. And let me just click on latest here and see if we get any confirmation. Scott Ritter's Twitter post is not firsthand. Okay. Is Ritter claiming that Lira was not dead? Okay, so this seems to be rather up in the air, and I will leave it at that. The story regarding Taylor Lorenz, it's not going anywhere. And the Washington Post decided to lie about what it did in Taylor Lorenz's piece, to just lie blatantly. We never published the information so that people could find the woman and head of Libs of TikTok. Well, in the original version of the article, there was a link which gave the information, okay, street address. And later, the link was removed. So I suppose that's only a half lie. Oh, but, you know, as most people understand it, if you put a link into a story which has doxing information, then that is doxing. There's no other way to put it. This is from Libby Emmons at Post Millennial. The Washington Post lies, claims they did not publish detail about Libs of TikTok's personal life. And here's another picture of Taylor Lorenz fake weeping. And I can never get enough of these pictures. The Washington Post lied, claiming that Lorenz had not published the home address of the Libs of TikTok account holder when, in fact, she had. The article was later scrubbed to purge those details, but they were there when the article was published at 6 a.m. Tuesday. Senior managing editor Cameron Barr said that Lorenz's practice of using Antifa-affiliated accounts to gain information and showing up at the homes of Libs of TikTok's family members were reporting methods that comport entirely with the Washington Post professional standards. Chaika Rachik, Barr writes, giving the name of the Libs of TikTok account holder who had chosen anonymity until Lorenz published her name and address in the Washington Post. In her management of the Libs of TikTok Twitter account and in media interviews, has had significant impact on public discourse, and her identity had become public knowledge on social media. We did not publish or link to any details about her personal life. You bloody liars. Is this going to be a free-for-all now? Because would Taylor Lorenz and her editor like their home details linked to in stories? Would they? How about all these people? There are a lot of anonymous people on the left. This is thought to be a right-wing phenomenon exclusively, but it is not. There are a great many anonymous people on the left, anonymous accounts, many of them, let's say Antifa affiliated. How about if all these, we learn all the details about all of these people? Turnabout is fair play, is it not? It's a story by Mark Moore in the in the New York Post. The Brooklyn woman behind the popular Libs of TikTok Twitter account, who was publicly identified in a Washington Post report this week, has vowed that attempts to intimidate her will not work because she will never be silenced. Responding to the article Tuesday evening, Rychik urged her followers to subscribe to her newsletter on Substack, calling it, quote, the best way to lend support and stay concerned. If I get banned from social media, I will never be silenced. In a Tuesday interview with Tucker Carlson, Rychik claimed the Washington Post report was meant to intimidate her into deleting her account. I think that what I'm doing is very effective, she said, and I think that a lot of people wanted to shut me down. They wanted to intimidate me into silence, and unfortunately for them, that's just never going to happen. Carlson asked Rychik about being publicly named by Lorenz, who has previously complained of being targeted by online harassment, leading her to allegedly experience, quote, severe PTSD and even consider suicide. I thought it was really humorous. It added a really nice layer of humor on top of the whole story, Raychick said. And I think that the fact that it was Taylor Lorenz, who was a known hypocrite, who was known to dox people, the fact that it was her doing all this, I think that just helps people rally support for me. Oh, and now, oh, yes, we'll get to Peter Thiel and, all the evil things that he's doing shortly. But before then, here's a piece by Brendan O'Neill at Spiked online. For more than a year, the Washington Post pretty much ignored the explosive story about the son of the President of the United States dumbly leaving his laptop packed with dodgy images and information in a repair shop in Delaware. But fret not, the Post has finally found a scandal it can sink its Watergate sharpened teeth into: the existence of a woke mocking online phenomenon called Libs of TikTok. Yes, who cares about Hunter Biden's laptop and other proper stories when there's an anti-PC Twitter account to rant and rage against? If you haven't heard of Libs of TikTok, you need to rectify that. It is a brilliant social media account that finds the batshit craziest videos on TikTok and puts them on Twitter and Instagram for us grown-ups to gnash our teeth over. You have no idea how far down the path of lunacy wokeness has gone until you peruse this account. It's like a virtual bedlam. We have recently been treated to the sight of a hyper-woke pastor explaining that God is queer, non-binary, and autistic, and a green-haired young woman saying that she refuses to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance because she's a socialist witch, and a preschool teacher in Florida, also with green hair, boasting that she has informed her infant pupils that she's a non-binary witch. There are a lot of witches on TikTok, and in schools, it seems. Libs of TikTok also features thruples who raise their kids gender neutrally, men who identify as women, complaining about period pain, and a trans species activist who identifies as a werewolf. Then there are the pronouns. So many pronouns. My favorite is the earnest, if slightly bleak TikToker whose pronouns are death, death self. So you would say, that's Death Jacket, and Death went to the prom all by Death Self. Cheery bunch, these turbo woke loons. The most alarming thing is the narcissism. Obsessive self-regard seems to be all the rage in youthful online cults. In the videos highlighted by Libs of TikTok, people talk endlessly about themselves and their neurodivergency. I'll just interrupt to say that that is the latest euphemism for being demented. Their sexual inclinations, their gender orientation, and they bark constantly at the faceless audience lapping up their vids, warning them to never use the wrong pronouns or to question my identification as a demino-binary, a gender person, or to step outside of one's own cultural lane. I just felt sad watching a young woman, blue hair, blue eyebrows, wondering if her use of black music in her TikTok videos is an example of digital blackface. Well, this isn't TikTok. There's a YouTube video that I'm going to mention now. She called herself Single Cat Mom. And in one of the, she talks about her wrecked life and how she thought that, she's 28 years old. So apparently over the hill, it would seem. Not a bad looking young woman, but she thought she would get married and have 3 or 6 cats, no babies mentioned. But then it all fell through because, like she's 28 years old and thus completely over the hill. And she has a bunch of videos about herself and her cats. And in one of these videos, she starts crying because she tells her audience that this cat that she has sometimes ignores her. Yeah, sometimes she tries to get the cat's attention, tries to get the cat to play or sit in her lap or whatever, and the cat isn't having any of it. And I thought, you literally didn't know that about cats, that they're not like dogs, that sometimes they just don't want anything to do with you, and there's really little that you can do about it? Is it possible for someone 28 years old who appears to be really like cats, or at least the idea of cats, and people look up everything on the internet these days, to not know that cats can be a little standoffish. Brendan O'Neill continues, the biggest talking point has been the school teachers featured on Libs of TikTok. There seem to be a fair few teachers in the US who see it as their job to infuse the next generation with woke nonsense and gender ideology. One teacher says she had her pupils pledge allegiance to the pride flag rather than the stars and stripes. Another coos over the fact that her young charges correct anyone who refers to her as a woman and say, no, she's NB. That's non-binary. Another, turquoise hair, describes herself as a queer teacher and says he's worried about the way that heterosexuality is, quote, pushed on our kids, unquote. You don't have to be Mary Whitehouse to find this stuff alarming. You don't have to be a gray-haired, leather-elbowed old Dawn to worry that 23-year-old pink-haired school teachers are telling kids that gender is fluid and witches are real and cool. Libs of TikTok has done a very good job in highlighting the consequences of today's nuttier pseudo-left ideologies, and as a result, it has become incredibly popular. So naturally, there's a backlash. The Washington Post saying that it's spreading anti-alphabet people sentiment. It depicts Libs of TikTok as a crazy right-wing hate machine. Of course, the Post is well within its rights to write about and condemn Libs of TikTok, although I am happy to inform that paper for free for at least 100 stories that are more pressing than the fact that a social media account is ripping the piss out of TikTok crackpots. But what interests me is the question of why Libs of TikTok has so seriously rattled sections of the media establishment and Twitterati. To me, O'Neill writes, it seems pretty clear. It's because this account has shone a light, and a harsh one at that, on the highly narcissistic and deeply destructive ideologies that young people are being exposed to every single day. TikTok is a young person's game. It has around 1 billion users, and 43% of them are aged between 18 and 24. 32% are 25 to 34. I'm sure my experience is typical of my age group. I have never so much as glanced at TikTok, except for the vids I see on Libs of TikTok, and yet my nieces and nephews are obsessed with it. It matters, no? That young people are encountering lunatic info about gender, sex, race, and manners every time they switch on the internet. This is what is infuriating many so-called liberals about Libs of TikTok. The account drags into the daylight the kind of thing that us mere adults, us oldish squares, are not meant to see. The greatest sin committed by Libs of TikTok is that it has thrown open the doors of these new political cults and allowed rational outsiders to peer inside to see how far things have gone. Yes, noticing things is a crime, as Steve Saylor has pointed out for years. Amplifying, as the kiddies like to say, the things you have noticed is worse than a crime. It is perhaps genocide. So it turns out that there is a strong religious or ethnic role played in this Taylor Lorenz controversy. She was identified for reasons unknown, I'll get back to that later, as being an Orthodox Jew by Taylor Lorenz. As far as I can tell, Lorenz is a exclusively German name. So someone called Colorfully Go, who is self-described on Twitter as animal lover, proud American, Israeli, and Zionist, union member, and daughter of a union member, queer. So this woman wrote, even if it turns out she's not a Lubavitcher, there are definitely Lubavitchers with the same name. I take from that context that apparently to this Jewish woman, Lubavitchers are definitely bad people. I responded to her, what is this, guilt by association? So, and Taylor Lorenz has a history in this regard. Sam Janney at Twitchy has this, catch the Jew. Seth Mandel and others point out that Taylor Lorenz went to great lengths to point out Libs of TikTok is an Orthodox Jew. As I have pointed out, we don't know what religion Taylor Lorenz is, whether she has a religion or whether she's an atheist. We don't even know how old she is. I got in trouble every so often for mentioning, I don't know, the race or religion, particularly if they were Jewish, when I was a reporter, and I pointed out in my defense that I only ever mentioned it if they brought it up first, or if typically they made it central to their argument, uh, as in, as a Jew, I'm instructing you that you must do as I say, which I find laughable, and I don't care what, as a whatever. No, your argument has merit or it doesn't. Now, why, oh, why would Taylor Lorenz go to such great lengths to make an issue of lib of TikTok's faith? One has to wonder if she would have included this little nugget in her hit piece if LOTT had been a Muslim or an atheist or even a Catholic. That seems oddly hateful. Seth Mandel said, special Passover, catch the Jew edition of the Washington Post. Well, you may have seen that the New York Times posted a long essay noting Passover, saying that it was time to pass over God. One expects that sort of thing from the New York Times. This is rather good from Seth Mandel. Democracy dies in the original German. And, well, yes, someone else on Twitter said, but it's okay because I've been reliably informed that Czech's Twitter feed, all Orthodox Jews are hateful bigots, so we really deserve it, apparently. Well, it turns out that a quite significant number of Orthodox Jews in the United States support Donald Trump, and many of them support him, well, vigorously. And that is not on, because Jews are supposed to be liberal, they're supposed to be progressive. Apparently, they're supposed to be, well, politically insane. And we've seen the treatment meted out to Stephen Miller. We've seen the treatment meted out to Eric Zemmour in France, and there were a lot of Jews carrying on against Eric Zemmour. You're Jewish. You are not supposed to believe this. You are not supposed to say things like this. The Inquisition had tweeted back in December of last year, did you know a high-profile New York Times reporter played a central role in an information warfare campaign that ruined an innocent person's life? She even tried to conceal the victim's Judaism while accusing him of anti-Semitism. Taylor Lorenz loathes David Markovich, a user on social audio app Clubhouse. In late 2020 or early 2020, a man named Vajresh Balaji falsely accuses Markovich of racism on Twitter. Multiple witnesses call bullshit, but guess who retweets the lie? Lorenz loves to attack people on Twitter, then deletes her tweets, undoes her retweets without acknowledging them, a violation of the New York Times social media guidelines for its reporters. Fortunately, we saved the receipts. Here's where the story gets really twisted. In February 2021, Markovich gets socially murdered by extremists. Their attack begins on Clubhouse and spills onto the rest of the internet. You can read the full thing in the thread linked here, but the key thing is Markovich didn't do anything wrong. Ever had mass hysteria weaponized against you? How about a mob? Ever been branded a racist abuser by a New York Times reporter? How about accused of making thousands of people suicidal? David Markovich went 4 for 4 and lived to tell the tale. Taylor Lorenz had tweeted, David is the man who told Jewish users who were subject to anti-Semitic attacks that Clubhouse didn't have issues with anti-Semitism. Markovich had said, I've yet to witness any anti-Semitism on Clubhouse. Destroying Markovich is fun for her. It's sick. She also asserts he minimized anti-Semitism, bad faith bunk. Lorenz quotes Markovich's tweet as though it's evidence of her claim, but all he said was in the first 2 months on Clubhouse, he hadn't personally heard anti-Semitism on the app. But Lorenz, who is not Jewish, omits altogether that David Markovich is. He and 5 siblings grew up in a yeshivish Orthodox community in Far Rockaway, Queens, and he spent 3 years studying the Talmud at a yeshiva in the center of Jerusalem. Yes, this is the sort of person that Taylor Lorenz is. why she has a bee in her bonnet about this. Hmm. And we have more on this from Stephen Crowder, who, well, there's a fair amount known about Taylor Lorenz. There is some that still remains inexplicably mysterious, such as how old she is. What do we know? She is a trust fund baby. She comes from old Greenwich money and attended boarding school rather, in the Swiss Alps. That wasn't my mistake. That was his. She now spends her days trolling the internet, looking to ruin the lives of people who disagree with her, or ruin the lives of children of people who disagree with her. Taylor Lorenz went against Pamela Geller's underage daughters. Geller is a firebrand on the right who spoke out against Islamic extremism. Lorenz exposed her underage daughter's Instagram accounts. Taylor Lorenz also went after Kellyanne Conway's underage daughter. Conway used to work for Donald Trump. Taylor, who was pushing 40, slid into her underage daughter's DMs looking for dirt. And going back to the story, yes, that the founder of Lorenz's story, that the founder of Libs of TikTok, at that point in time, she also, at that point in time, or then, as other people might say, people who can write, she also claimed to be proudly Orthodox Jewish. Oh, okay. All right. And yes, it's very strange. I don't know. Maybe this woman has issues with certain people, as they say. And this story, or the Jewish aspect of it, ended up being taken up by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. I don't know. Taylor Lorenz might be making some enemies that she doesn't want. Oh, yes. Yes, and apparently, according to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, her name is rather associated with the Lubavitchers. So I guess we can make this, even more specifically Jewish. And speaking of Peter Thiel, there is a long essay at Vanity Fair by a fellow who was amusingly called James Pogue, inside the New Right, where Peter Thiel is placing his biggest bets. They're not MAGA, they're not QAnon. Curtis Yarvin and the Rising Right are crafting a different strain of conservative politics. And what kind of strain might that be? Malmesbury Man tweets, oh, well, first let's have a chunk from the story. They have a wildly diverse set of political backgrounds with influences ranging from 17th century Jacobite royalists to Marxist cultural critics to so-called reactionary feminists to the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, whom they sometimes refer to with semi-ironic affection as Uncle Ted. Which is to say that this new right is not a part of the conservative movement as most people would understand it. Yes, and let's let people on the right be gatekept by people who are very much not on the right, because that's the way conservatives like to play the game. It's better described as a tangled set of frameworks for critiquing the systems of power and propaganda that most people reading this probably think of as the way the world is. So if you disagree with Pogue, one is apparently, well, demented. And one point shapes it all. It is a project to overthrow the thrust of progress, at least such as liberals understand the world. Malmesbury commented, LOL, what is the thrust of progress? Is that like being fisted by Foucault? And apparently these people have, serious disagreements, not just with progressivism, but with the conservative movement. Now, Pat Buchanan was railing against this going back to the 1990s, but everyone decided that Pat Buchanan was a very bad man, probably a Nazi. And David Frum infamously said that he and what all of these people on the right, Thomas Fleming and Robert Novak, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they were actually traitors. He didn't use that word, but they were anti-American. David Frum, laughably, of course, is not an American, except by adoption. But no, this just goes into exhaustive detail. But then this is weird. Okay. Yarvin, Moldbug, as people know him, had asked his new girlfriend, Lydia Lawrenson, a 37-year-old founder of a progressive magazine, to vet me. The radical right turn her life had taken created complications. One of my housewat mates was like, I don't know if I want Curtis in our house. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. I understand why you're saying that. Lawrenson had been a well-known blogger and activist in the BDSM scene back when Yarvin was the central early figure in a world of neo-reactionary writers. Oh, so neo-reactionary is now coterminous with BDSM, which means torture. Is it? Interesting to find that out. No question about it. But let's go to what is binding this together. What is it? It's the deep state. And the deep state now includes the media, and it now includes Antifa. Darren Beattie tweeted in announcing his expose, this is a story of how the new Stasi operates. Energy flows from governments to nonprofits to hackers, and finally to aged-out journalists publishing hit pieces on dissidents in Jeff Bezos's paper of record. Libs of TikTok doxing uncovers secret hacker government mercenary alliance behind regime's war on MAGA Americans. American dissidents of all stripes are ablaze with anger after the Washington Post's most repugnant reporter, Taylor Lawrence, published yet another piece trying to ruin someone more popular than her. And we already know what Libs of TikTok is about, so I'll skip that bit. Oh, but here's a relevant one. This is from yet another teacher. Parents need to stay the F out of classrooms. Yes, indeed, because children do not belong to God. They do not belong to parents. Their parents, they belong to the state. And this is what people, the progressives, they really believe this. They firmly believe it. They passionately believe it, which is why they push so hard for government-funded daycare. Because we can't have these children being poisoned by the ignorance and bigotry of their parents. A few people are more repugnant than Taylor Lawrence, who once falsely accused billionaire Mark Andreessen of using the R word in a clubhouse room and whose age is humorously difficult to pin down. Mere weeks ago, Lawrence had a meltdown over online harassment in an interview with MSNBC, then pressured the channel into deleting the interview. The revolver piece continues. Lawrence may be repulsive, to say the least. She certainly courted assiduously all the hatred coming her way, but there is a bigger story here. This incident is a case study in how the ruling regime uses cutout so-called NGOs and so-called hackers to target dissidents for annihilation. It wasn't Taylor Lawrence who doxed Libs of TikTok. Lawrence is a used-up cocktail waitress for the regime. She's far too talentless to achieve such a feat. Instead, it was a motley crew of regime actors. The original doxer of the woman behind Libs of TikTok was an Antifa Twitter user named Karma161, who gloated last weekend about using sleuth work to uncover the account's original tweets and name. Another Twitter user, Travis Brown, promoted and confirmed Karma161's work, then went on to unearth and reveal even more information about the woman behind Libs of TikTok. In the Washington Post, Taylor Lawrence herself credits Brown for confirming Libs of TikTok's identity. Who is Travis Brown? In essence, a man paid by the German government to target, dox, and harass the international left's ideological enemies. Brown is the creator of the so-called hate speech tracker, a program whose explicit purpose is to aid Antifa extremists in tracking and archiving statements by its enemies and find connections between them to aid in doxing. Oh, what societal challenge does your prototype address? This is from the hate speech tracker. Many right-wing extremist movements are currently developing on social media. Ooh, yes, they often delete their content, change their username, and get banned from social media platforms. This makes it harder to resist their actions. The hate speech tracker is a set of composable software tools that enable people affected by harassment and hate speech on social media to record and share information about their experiences. For those wondering, Brown's work egregiously violates the terms of use of the sites that he tracks hate on. As Brown himself noted on his website, Twitter's own privacy policy states, as such, we prohibit the use of Twitter data in any way that would be inconsistent with people's reasonable expectations of privacy. And it goes on. Brown also openly admits to using certain tactics on Twitter that probably violate the terms of service. This isn't some one-off rule. Much like Brandy Zadrozny, whom Revolver profiled in 2020, Travis Brown exists as a small part of a much larger ecosystem. Brown's doxing operation isn't an independent venture. He is backed by the Prototype Fund, a project of the Open Knowledge Foundation Germany, an independent, not-for-profit organization. The notion that the foundation is independent is, of course, a lie. OKFG receives funding directly from the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. In other words, the German government directly financed the doxing of libs and TikTok, and Taylor Lorenz's calculated attempt on behalf of the Washington Post to destroy her life. Prototype, by the way, doesn't just fund doxing operations, it funds the mass arrival of so-called asylum seekers into Europe. It backs the perpetual post-2016 campaign against fake news. Is there something about trans voices? You bet there's something about trans voices. We are a software for voice training for trans people. The same organization that paid to dox libs of TikTok is also paying to teach male-to-female transgenders how not to sound like Barry White. Prototype doesn't limit itself to online flame wars. It all takes an interest in real wars, funding an archive to gather alleged eyewitness reports of atrocities in the Syrian civil war. Syrian Archive acts vague about what position it takes on the war, but its website leaves no room for doubt. This is an organization that exists to blame Bashar Assad and, by extension, Russia for chemical attacks that at least one case turned out to be a hoax. In fact, its anti-Russia orientation is so obvious that in the last few weeks it has pivoted to warning about imminent Russian chemical attacks in the Ukraine. The same German government-backed organization that is targeting political dissidents in the West is also funding the transgender mania and the foreign policy priorities of the Western elite. In many ways, Prototype remembers Bellingcat, a so-called NGO funded by the United Kingdom that played a key role in amplifying the Russian collusion narrative, targets so-called far-right domestic dissidents, and promoted the Syria gas attacks hoax. The Grey Zone revealed in 2021 that Bellingcat took UK intelligence money to run overseas influence operations intended to weaken Russia. America, unsurprisingly, loves this tactic as well. In February, the Hacker Collective Distributed Denial of Secrets, DDoS, leaked hacked materials from Give, Send, Go that docked donors to the Canadian trucker convoy. As we previously observed, that is to say, Revolver.news, DDoS is basically a de facto government operation. In 2020, the Trump Department of Homeland Security claimed that DDoS is a criminal hacker group. Despite that, it enjoys IRS nonprofit status. DDoS's high-profile hacks have, almost without exception, targeted domestic dissidents against the regime or its international enemies rather than the regime itself. Besides doxing every single Give, Send, Go donor, DDoS's other targets include Gab, Parler, local police departments, Russia, Myanmar, and right-wing chat groups online. Now, practically every major Canadian news organization, with Global News perhaps being the biggest offender, essentially now acts as agents of the deep state. Oh, here is a hate crime crisis in Canada. And how do we know there's a hate crime crisis? Well, let's go to these experts on hate crimes who work for so-called NGOs. Who funds these NGOs? Governments, including the government of Canada's George Soros and that ilk. These are made up stories designed to silence dissidents. There is now no distinction whatsoever between what I call the regime, I and others call the regime media, and the regime itself. They are the same thing. The actual hacker who claims credit for hacking GiveSendGo is Aubrey Cottle, who is the co-founder of the old anonymous hacking collective. In late February, if you go to Kiwi Farms, you can find a great deal about this Aubrey Cottle fellow, and it is rather worrying, just in terms of, I don't know, personal sanity. In late February, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Hillary Clinton called for Anonymous and other hacker groups to launch more cyber attacks on Russia. Does anybody think for even a moment that the CIA and other agencies are encouraging such behavior behind the scenes? Well, as I mentioned yesterday, it would be, if we had a useful opposition party in Canada, one of the questions that would be asked of the Prime Minister of Canada and cabinet ministers involved is regarding the truckers and what happened to GiveSendGo. Was CSIS any other Canadian intelligence agency or anyone involved with Canadian intelligence or acting as a contractor to Canadian intelligence involved in the hacking and leaking of the donation details to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation? Because I'm sure they would lie, but it would be nice to get them on the record about this. And in further news of there being no distinction, practical distinction anymore between the regime media and government, this is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. German media outlets responded to violent riots in Sweden, mainly involving Muslim migrants, by claiming the unrest occurred as a result of so-called right-wing demos. Yes, really. Multiple Swedish towns and cities have been hit with violent domestic disorder over the past week, unrest that continued into the Easter weekend as 26 police officers were injured. Mobs of Muslim migrant youth set police vehicles on fire and hurled stones at police officers, with some shouting Allahu Akbar during the rampage. As the Associated Press reported, Swedish authorities said the riots specifically target police and were the work of criminal gangs, a common euphemism for Muslim migrant youths. There is a lot to suggest that the police were targeted, said Sweden's National Police Commander Jonas Heising, noting that the main target for the rioters was Swedish police and society, not Rasmus Paludan, a right-wing politician who threatened to burn copies of the Quran. Muslim youths routinely stage riots in Swedish cities in response to authorities arresting violent criminals. Large-scale riots also occurred 2 years ago. However, according to the German media, the riots were actually staged by a shadowy right-wing extremists. A broadcaster, EDZF, I hope I don't get in trouble for using the 26th letter of the Latin alphabet, reported that there were riots at right-wing demos in Malmo. After the approval of right-wing rallies, there were riots again in Sweden during the night, states the article, with no mention that the police were actually being attacked by Muslim gangs. To the uninformed reader, the riots actually involved right-wing extremists attacking police, reports Remix. The article seems to be an attempt by the ZDF to downplay the role of Muslims in yet another public disturbance in the already highly troubled immigrant neighborhoods in Swedish cities. And let's go to a Canadian example of this. This is in the Toronto Star by Heather Schofield, who is their economics columnist. This is an exceedingly convoluted piece. Elon Musk's attempt to buy Twitter should be setting off alarm bells in Ottawa. It's no wonder that the Liberal election promise to have all legislation governing the internet lined up within 100 days of taking office has run into difficulty. If they're going to, govern the internet What difference does it make who owns Twitter? Hmm? Because there's already a lot of speech on Twitter, even though the Twitter of 2016, 2017, 2018 has vanished, and people are routinely kicked off for nothing. But there's still a lot of stuff on Twitter that causes progressives to burst into tears and to tear their hair out. So, there's big money, big ego, and big tech rolled up in a big ball of intrigue. That's some fine writing there. Let's see. Yes, and we have a description here of, in the face of internet-fueled terror attacks, collapsing traditional media. Oh my. And mounting disinformation about the pandemic. What do you mean that the mRNA experimental gene therapy has proven to be an absolute bust, even without going into contraindications, which are in the millions or tens of millions? They were pushing legislation on 3 different fronts. They wanted to impose Canadian content requirements on streaming services. They wanted to build a revenue stream for traditional media by having the web giants give up some of their advertising revenue. And they wanted to quash hate speech online. What is hate speech, you might ask? Whatever Heather Schofield doesn't like. It's that simple. The goal was to bolster Canadian culture news sources while circumscribing the power of large multinational companies and stifling the more dangerous elements of the internet. But this didn't work in part because the Conservatives whipped up opposition by equating those efforts with a government clampdown on freedom of speech. Well, it is a clampdown on freedom of speech. If you ban misinformation and disinformation, and then you simply define anything as you don't like as being anti-progressive, as being misinformation, disinformation, these can be banned, will be banned by the Canadian government. Yes, that is quashing free speech. But of course, people like Heather Schofield do not believe in free speech. But let's get to the end of it here. She quotes Musk as saying, "I invested in Twitter as I believe in its potential to be the platform for free speech around the globe, and I believe free speech is a societal imperative for a functioning democracy. However, since making my investment, I now realize the company will neither thrive nor serve this societal imperative in its current form," unquote. Schofield has a terrible warning for Canadians. This push towards hands-off has sort of alarm bells in the American civil rights community who fear for the fate of minorities of all kinds. It should set off alarm bells in Ottawa too. So what is she suggesting here? That Elon Musk is somehow going to have the power to roll back civil rights legislation? Is he going to put black people and other minorities in the United States into digital gulags or concentration camps? Or is it more to the point that Joanne Reid might get very upset about things that are said about her or Eli Mistal or Ibram X. Kendi? They're not trying to hide it any longer. There's a piece that's spiked by Matthew Lesh, "The online safety bill would treat us all like children," which rather misses the point. That is the whole point of this British bill and the point of all such bills around the world, that you are children. You're not a member of the elite. You're not an oligarch. You need Big Mom telling you, "I don't want you hanging out with those friends anymore. They're not a good influence on you, and I've never even met their mothers." This is the whole point of it. And again, they are not trying to hide it. We don't want people doing their own research. Notwithstanding the fact that is precisely what reporters do with every story they write, is to do their own research. But of course, they're experts at it because they went to J school. And as we know, J school graduates are the sole arbiter of what is true throughout the universe in perpetuity. Similarly, at Unheard, Kathleen Stock, who's a former professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, who was driven out of that job despite being a lesbian feminist because she is one of the dreaded TERFs and insisted in saying that men are men and women are women. Uh, Her piece is called "You Can't Police Offense." Well, you can police offense. And hate speech is now something that results in anyone with blue or green hair or with a ring through their septum like a beast of burden feeling the sads. That's what hate speech means. And we can't have freaks feeling sad. And a better piece at Unheard by our old friend Mary Harrington. And the piece is called "Why Taylor Lorenz Can Dox Whoever She Wants." And it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple, actually. The offense committed by libs of TikTok becomes clearer. The account didn't so much create hateful content as violate the progressive consensus edict that its members alone may curate and narrate the internet and thus shape real-world politics. For this, a private individual has had her identity exposed, potentially subjecting her to the attentions of all manner of eccentric and possibly vengeful individuals. Somehow I doubt this will be the end of libs of TikTok, who seems to have come back fighting, but her exposure represents an escalation in the war for who controls the stories that percolate out of the maelstrom of online discourse. Well, I guess this is what all such stories come down to. The Leninist maxim of Kogo, whom. And some good news from Florida. The update: Florida Senate votes 23-16 to end Disney's special tax privilege, its self-governing power, and special exemption status. Again, one really has to praise Governor DeSantis from consulting the praxis of Viktor Orban of Hungary. And in other good news from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News, a production called The Family Sex Show aimed at children aged 5 or over that was described by the theater company responsible as an alternative to porn has been canceled after thousands of people signed a petition opposing it. The company invited parents to bring their kids to the show, advertising that there would be full nudity and discussion of topics completely unsuitable for children. The show was due to be performed at Bristol's Tobacco Factory next month, but that venue has become the second to bow out after a backlash. Typically, the company is claiming the deluge of criticism they received included unprecedented threats and abuse from extremists, and that is why the event was called off. Oh, yes, and they lied, because these people all lie. The company claimed it had liaised with child safeguarding experts. However, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children had apparently never heard of it. From CN Kumar, the Family Sex Show repeatedly claimed that they had taken advice from child safeguarding experts. However, the show contravened NSPCC guidelines. After they were contacted, the NSPCC also said that not only had they never heard of it, but they had no input into devising it. Well, yes, they always lie. That's what they do best, although one is tempted to hope that they've just, since they've gone so far, they're getting worse at it. Like the Washington Post saying, we never included, addresses or any such thing. Oh, yeah, you put it there and then you removed it after people noticed. But it's still readily available. If you want this woman's address to harass her, well, you can find it easily enough because Taylor Lorenz put it in a Washington Post story. And I think we know why she put it in that story. Let's go back to the chat. Okay, let's scroll up. Yarvin seems all over the place. I don't know what he is, says Oscar Toe. I guess I read him 10 years ago, something like that, 8-10 years ago. His lengthy, balls-aching essays. And I stopped reading him after a couple of years for this reason. I would get to the end of his essay and think, what is he on about? And I think I'm a fairly clever man. And if I don't understand what he's on about, that should suggest to me that he is a muddled thinker and probably a muddled writer. David Wright says, Lyra, as little as 6 months ago, told viewers to get out of the West, given his present situation. Highly ironic and god-awful advice. Just leave your home and don't fight. I hope he is at least not in the hand of the Ukraine Nazis, says Birkin Sultanov. CRP is probably getting tortured as a prisoner of war, says John Vance. Metal Mike says, what do you think of Paul Wells's leaving legacy media and going independent? It was behind a paywall, the essay where he gave his reasons for this. I gather he was being excessively edited, or so he thought he was being excessively edited at Maclean's. I don't know. I go back and forth on Paul Wells. His Substack, if that's what it is, appears to be rather like those newsletters that they were published years ago, in which you got really detailed information about government activities. And typically companies would pay hundreds of dollars a year for this. Maybe he can make it work. I don't know. But I'll tell you this. It used to be quite a hard rule that news was news and opinion was opinion. If you invite a man or a woman into your newspaper or magazine to give their opinion, then you print that opinion. Now, of course, you're going to read the story for defamation. You're going to read it for incitement, possible incitement. You're going to read it for obvious syllogisms. For instance, if you spell someone's name wrong, or you get the dates wrong of some historical event. But no, differences of opinion do not fit in there. Of course, the New York Times has been buggering about its opinion columnist for years. Was it Alexander Chancellor wrote once about this unpleasant experience that he'd had with the New York Times? Oh, we want you to change this. Oh, we want you to change that. Oh, we want you to change the others. Well, why did you invite me to write for you if you're going to make all of these changes? Birkin Sultanov says UKR is a money laundering operation. Yes. It is not only the world's capital of money laundering, it is the world's capital of the surrogate baby racket, and is the world's capital of what we used to call white slavery. That is to say, pretty much the kidnapping of young girls to be made sex slaves elsewhere in the world. And, okay. What else do we have here? We got a lot of comments today. I'm glad to see that. Yeah, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that. Hello to True Greenbeard. I keep getting that wrong. And, okay, scrolling down here looking for new people. Yarvin is apparently funded by a neocon think tank, says Chogakin 666. Yes, Wikipedia has her birthday, Taylor Lorenz, as either 1978 or 1984 to 87. That's 9 years of difference there, up to 9 years. Then that is a lot, an awful lot. Most of these new right people seem to be edgy artists, says Oscar Toe. Well, I don't think Peter Thiel is an edgy artist. Hasidim actually started in the Ukraine, says Birkin Sultanov. I mentioned on Twitter the other day or last week that with the possible exception of the Germans, the Ukrainians have killed more Jews than any other people on earth. And, but now Zelensky, he is just, one of the greatest Jewish heroes ever. And here's why we must love the Ukraine. Despite that pesky Azov battalion, I see that it's described as a battalion, it's described as a brigade, it's described as a division. Hello, Dr. Paul. Yes. He was talking about the trial of someone called Oswald Paul, and guilt by association. Of course, Richard Wagner's dog was called Paul, and he was very fond of this dog. It died when he was away, and he exhumed the dog and gave it what he thought was a proper burial and marking stone. So, if Richard Wagner had a dog called Paul, I don't know. That sounds pretty guilt by association inducing. Gamian says, I'm glad the Department of Justice is standing up for all of us and trying to reinstate mask mandates. True defender of the people. And who else do we have here? KMG's forehead looks quite big today. So much brain. Respect, says Gamian. I suppose it's the way that the light is catching my hair. Essentially, Jada Pinkett smithing the top of it. Of course, I don't pay that much attention to that. I can't say that I'm a vain man. Not that I have any reasons to be vain, rather. A giant art production. Solo says these people are evil demons, totally irredeemable. Every single star writer. I'm going to watch, says Anran, some of today's Depp heard after Kevin. I believe they showed a picture, a video today in the court of the dump she took. Okay, I'm not going to repeat that. The woman is an absolute psycho. It could be. However, I've said this before. I will say it again. And the same applies to Brad Pitt. As sorry as one can be for these men, no one forced them to marry crazy lesbians. Freaks Feeling Sad is a great name for an emo band, says Metal Mike. Between this and Moldbug having a dominatrix leftoid girlfriend, what is the world coming to? Is that a reference to what, Richard Spencer and his lefty girlfriend? I don't know if he'll win the case, but she should be ruined by this one way or the other, says Anrun. I see a lot of negative stuff about Amber Heard on social media. I don't think she's going to be ruined by this. The allegations have been out in the open for, what, a year, 2 years, or more. It seems to me there are some similarities between Francis Yockey and Alexander Dugin, says Chogokin666. Oh, this is springtime for Francis Yockey because some new book on the shocking rise of this nasty kind of conservatism profiled Francis Yockey, who is not a person who got very much attention on the right, even the so-called far right. KMG says needs a fedora, says Seven Costanza. Does one wear a hat indoors? All right. Handsome woman, says Chokin666. She's a gorgeous woman. And I think that there have been various stories to the effect that she reaches the platonic ideal of what men are looking for in women in terms of her face and her figure. I don't know whether I've actually ever seen her appear in things because I don't watch spandex movies. Has she been in any other kind of movies besides spandex movies? And let's talk about the bestest country on earth, which is, of course, the Ukraine. Never mind that no one had paid any attention, except neocons had paid any attention to the place until, 5 minutes ago or 8 years ago. I'm reminded of a hit from 1963, sung by Leslie Gore, which was written by Marvin Hamlish and produced by no less than Quincy Jones. Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, because that's what the Ukraine is. It's sunshine, lollipops, rainbows, and of course, sunflowers. Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. Everything that's wonderful is what I feel when we're together. Brighter than a lucky penny. When you're near, the rain goes, disappears, dear, and I feel so fine just to know that you are mine. My life, or the Ukraine, is sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. That's how this refrain goes. So come on, join in, everybody. And if that sounds like a demand, it is. It was reported Lithuania, I guess following Germany, bans using letter Z as show of support for Russia's war in the Ukraine. Mark McKinnon, who is senior international correspondent for the Globe and Mail, responded, "Cray, this makes aero sense." Get it? He dropped the 26th letter of the Latin alphabet. I responded, "Sure it does. It's called mass formation psychosis. And there is no other way to describe this." What are they calling Russians? They're calling Russians orcs now. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. The Wimbledon tennis tournament will ban Russian and Belarusian players from competing in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has been revealed. I think I'm going to refer to Ukraine, not just as the Ukraine any longer. Henceforth, I'm going to call it what they used to call it, Little Russia. And then, of course, I'd have to call Belarus White Russia, but I'm fine with that. So, yes, banned from Wimbledon. Citing someone familiar with the decision, Sportico reports that players holding the nationalities will not be allowed to enter the tournament. As we highlighted last month, British Minister for Sport Nigel Huddleston suggested that Russians would have to display their ideological conformity to the current narrative surrounding the conflict to be able to take part. However, this option has now presumably been extinguished with an outright ban being imposed. The ban will prevent world number 2 Daniil Medvedev, last year's US Open winner, from competing at Wimbledon, which starts June 27th. Fellow Russian top 30 men's players Andrei Rublev, there's a storied name, Karen Khachanov, and Aslan Karatsev will also miss out, as will former world's number 1 Victoria Azarenka and current number 4 Arina Sabalenka. This did not happen during the Cold War. When there were threats at several times of nuclear war, during Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Berlin airlift crisis, during the Berlin Wall crisis, during the invasion of Hungary, the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Soviet chess players, dancers, musicians, they regularly came to the West. But apparently Russia is a far worse country than the Soviet Union was. Why could that be? Could they got rid of communism? Could that be the reason? I strongly suspect that it is. Because, of course, neoconservatism is a bastard child of Trotskyite thinking. And the leading neoconservatives, at the beginning, they were pretty much all former Trotskyites. There is a Twitter feed called UMF, or Ukrainian Memes Forces. Best Ukrainian memes from Twitter and Reddit. Joined February 2022. It has 154,700 followers. And here's a burning city. And never again. And there's a swastika again. And there's that banned 26th letter of the Latin alphabet. Because you see, they're the same. Who are the actual Nazis fighting for? They're fighting for Ukraine, prominently fighting for Ukraine. But let's pretend that isn't happening. In fact, bad things will happen to you. Bad things will happen to you if you point that out. Now, let's talk about World War kitsch. Here's a picture of the Spice Girls back when there were 5 of them. And they have words attached to them. If you want to be my lover, you got to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. Let's once again connect sexual pleasure with death, because that's what we're all about now. And there's a whole bunch of cringe, absolute cringe memes here. Yes, and the Ukrainians are the Chads here. Yeah, sure they are, because that's what a Chad does. He kidnaps women and children and holds them in buildings which the Nazis hole up in. And oh, we're not going to surrender because we're in impregnable positions here. Well, I guess these positions will have to be leveled. Do you know that you're killing women and children, even babies, you monsters? Well, I think we know who the monsters are here. You will notice that the 24/7 claims about Russian atrocities, they came second after documented evidence of Ukrainian atrocities against Russian POWs, including, shooting helpless POWs, shooting them and in the knee and such like, leaving them to bleed out, while mocking them foully, calling up their mothers and saying foul things about them and laughing about it. Yeah, and that wasn't looking too good for the neo-Nazi heroes of the present conflict. They don't exist, but at the same time, they're ever so tough, and that's why they are constantly being interviewed by Western media without any kind of disclaimer. If you go to Twitter and you search for Ukraine puppies, guess what you find? These puppies sticking together in Ukraine, they have a secret, though. They aren't alone. Isn't that sweet? War in Ukraine, the moment a puppy is rescued from the rubble, not only are the Ukrainians brave, but their love of animals has totally won me over. What amazing people. Prayer emojis. God bless them all. And I'm going to have to say, how many puppies do you think were dumped into this rubble before they found one that actually survived? And here's another one from Marina Betsa. An 84-year-old man saved his entire family by driving his old car for several days in the eastern Ukraine under Russian shelling. Saved his son, son's wife, 3 grandchildren, and a puppy. And of course, that was the most valuable save there, the puppy. Oh, here we are again. Puppy rescue in Ukraine. And I suppose they're not looking for bodies which might have been buried. Of course, they're looking for puppies. Ukrainian animal rescue. A new case. Little baby puppy was found dumped on the rubbish pit. Luckily, we were able to save him. Please donate to help us run. Yes, but I'm sure these donations will not be fungible. Today, Adam is a home editor at Sky News. Today, Adam meets a tumble of puppies, and they're nothing cuter than a tumble of puppies. I think the existence of this particular tumble of puppies, and they're certainly cute, justifies heavy weapons shipments to the Ukraine, probably justifies Western boots on the ground, although the British are already there, and it probably even justifies World War III, because puppies are just so doggone cute. You see what I did there? Huh? You see what I did there? And, oh, you can search pets or cats, and you'll get similar results. Apparently there's war on the right. And the bad people are saying bad things. This is from Politico. Jacob Heilbrunn. Trumpian conservatives hold an emergency meeting over Russia at a Washington Marriott. The nationalist wing of the Republican Party wrestles with what Putin's war means for their movement. I think they're more wrestling with the question of what it means for America and why America should get involved in this. How is this an American dispute? Well, it's an American dispute in the sense that the United States government now holds the position, as it has done in the past, that there are only 2 countries in the world which enjoy sovereignty under what used to be known as the Westphalian Principle. And those 2 countries are the United States of America and Israel. All other countries in the world, their sovereignty is completely conditional upon U.S. government approval. Jacob Heilbrunn is the editor of The National Interest and author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. I will remind everyone again that neoconservatism is a mystery religion. And what is the mystery? It is a death cult. The neoconservatives, everything they touch turns to death. I can only regard them as, well, satanic, just satanic. And we have a piece in Quillette: Ukrainians are nobody's pawns except the United States State Department and, George Soros, and of course the oligarchs that run that country, by someone called Robert Trashinsky. And we are told that this is a pseudonym. Wait a minute, I thought that pseudonyms were evil, that we all had to use our names. So we find out that something called the Atlas Society, who is just their logo now is just Ukraine, sunflowers, etc. And that is Quillette, of course, has gone nuts over the Ukraine, and they were never to be trusted. These people at Quillette, they are classical liberals seeking to gatekeep the conservative movement, or just conservatism, or the right. And it's a funny kind of coalition that they've put together. Let's see, there are Banderites, oligarchs, neocons, and now Randians. As Jerry Seinfeld would say, a real Algonquin round table you got there. Let's check in on Drudge and see whether World War III has begun. No. And, right at the top, there's nothing about Ukraine. Trump meltdown. Okay. Wow. Is Trump getting bored with the Ukraine? That could be significant, Of course, we all know how short internet news cycles are. Let's check in on antiwar.com for some headlines. British court orders Assange extradition. Yes, Julian Assange is not an American citizen, so how he could be guilty of treason is a very interesting question. Biden set $800 million more arms for Ukraine. After a call with allies, Biden says U.S. will send more artillery. U.S. always preparing the next weapons package for Ukraine. Oh, and this is one of my favorite stories. This slipped out somehow. That it's now admitted the White House has almost zero ability to track weapons it sends to Ukraine. I wonder how many of these weapons are going to end up in, say, Mexico. I bet the narco gangs would be willing to pay top dollar for these weapons. Now, of course, most of the Twitter sites which have made some sort of attempt to give some sort of, perhaps you could say, a disinterested or honest approach to what is actually going on the ground in the Ukraine, well, they have been banned by Twitter because Twitter has decided that the Ukraine is the best country on earth, and everything the Ukraine says is true, despite the ghost of Kiev, despite Snake Island, despite the destruction of the Babi Yar Memorial, despite the crazy Russians attempting to demolish Chernobyl for some reason, despite Mariana from the hospital, despite the civilians at various buildings in Mariupol, this all being made up. But no, Twitter says that everything that the Ukraine says is true. And since Twitter and its fact checkers are the sole arbiters of truth throughout the universe unto perpetuity, well, that's right. And as we like to say, that's a good thing. Moon of Alabama is still up. Let's see. U.S. weapons for Ukraine disappearing into a black hole, according to CNN. I don't know how that slipped through. Someone called Bernd Neuer responded, don't worry, they'll show up. New on Moon of Alabama, and they have a blog as well at moonofalabama.org. Some of the weapons delivered to Ukraine will be used against us. Again, from Bernd Neuner, I am curious how Western media spin will adapt after phase 2 will be a lot more difficult to portray Russia as disorganized and falling. Well, yeah, I suppose they're going to spin it this way, that they'd already lost Donbass, so what's happening in the Donbass now is it's not a real loss. Phase 2 will include the liberation of all of Donetsk and Luhansk as demarcated on the above map by the dashed red lines. And Ukraine maps is gone. Russians with attitude, that's gone. Yes, maps Ukraine gone. Russia USA still exists for the time being. Of course, they're all saying, you should subscribe to what's on Telegram because we're all going to be kicked off Twitter, perhaps because we didn't run enough tweets about cute puppies being rescued. Oh, well, Russian American Daily at Russia USA is still up. Of course, I would need to add my birth date to my bio on Twitter to see a whole bunch of their stories, because this is another way that Twitter uses to censor anything which is offensive to Ukrainian eyes and ears. Russia USA appears to have decided that they're not really going to publish much anymore because publish and perish, as they say. Well, they don't say that. I turned it on its head. And I'm not the first person to make that joke, obviously. Let's see if there's anything new from Pedro Gonzalez of Chronicles. Oh, he's working on a big piece about Taylor Lorenz, apparently. So, and let's see if there's anything at information. Liberation.com. Justice Sotomayor, people who know FBI crime stats must be banned from capital case juries because of, well, okay. In criminal trials, you have to prove that someone is guilty of a specific crime. And this use of similar case evidence, well, I guess that's new. It's been around for a little while now. It seems to be against the whole of the point of our system of justice, that you don't prejudice people against the defendant just because someone has committed a crime or even the same crime before. Doesn't mean that they are guilty of the crime with which they are charged now. Let's see, Vox Day. After nearly 2 years of harsh lockdowns and vaccine mandates, Australia's Prime Minister declares that if you suffered any adverse effects from the vaccines they forced on you, it's your fault. After all, you didn't have to go to work or to school or go to the supermarket. And he repeats a famous line, John Belushi, from Animal House, you something up, you trusted them. Indeed. Former U.S., now that's from 34 days ago, so I won't go into that. Let's go back to Joseph Tainter and collapse of complex societies. Overall economic productivity. Complex societies with large, well-developed economies have historically been able to sustain only rather inferior rates of economic growth. Latecomers to economic growth tend to have higher growth rates that early starters do not. Rates of economic growth are highest in middle-income countries, followed by high-income and low-income nations. Christensen infers from these data that through time, rates of economic growth tend to slow down. Such a trend suggests that societies with more developed economies face a situation in which the productivity of GNP for stimulating further growth tends to decline. Although some authors believe that technical innovation responds to economic productivity, there are also data suggesting that technical innovation often occurs along a curve of declining marginal productivity. This isn't Tainter's example, but computers, there's a prime example of that. Figure 17 shows reductions in fuel consumption of steam engines resulting from increases in thermal efficiency from the early 18th to middle 20th centuries. In such a field, technical innovation slows down as return for improvement diminish. For the steam engine, the remaining possibilities of fuel saving were reduced as thermal efficiency was increased. A doubling of efficiency in this century would save much less fuel per engine than would a 10% increase in the 18th century, and the saving would be much harder to achieve. Zolatis has argued that the productivity of industrialism for producing social welfare is declining. In partial support of this assertion, he points out that while U.S. per capita product increased 75% from 1950 to 1970, weekly work hours declined by only 9.5%. Well, one could point out that we use the gross domestic product now instead of the gross national product. Gross domestic product includes government inputs, which means that the governments, as they do, borrow stupendous amounts of money and then say, look, see, it works. The GDP is increasing. The GDP in the Western countries wouldn't be increasing at all, but for the fact, as previously mentioned, that the inflation statistics are corrupted. They're useless. Let's leave out of the so-called basket all of those things, such as real estate, which isn't particularly important, say, to people's lives, or the cost of education, or the cost of medicine, to give two other examples. Back to a tainter explaining declining marginal returns in complex societies. The discerning reader might reasonably question much that was presented in the preceding section. It might be said that examples of declining marginal productivity have deliberately been sought, and that the role of technological innovation in alleviating such problems was not considered. In fact, what was presented are simply examples of what is proposed to be a problem common to many situations of increasing complexity, intensification and resource extraction, and economic growth. The fact that such examples can be compiled does not mean that all economic trends follow the same curve, nor that socioeconomic processes in complex societies follow only the law of diminishing returns. It also does not mean that such trends occurring in any specific sphere are irreversible. Where this law is operative, however, serious consequences can be expected, and those are the situations of interest here. The role of technological innovation is another matter. More will be said about it later. Suffice to say at this point that technical innovation, in at least some cases, e.g. steam engines, as just described, can be shown to decline in its marginal product over time. The proposition that societies regularly face declining productivity for investment in complexity can be more securely demonstrated if it can be shown why this is so. This can indeed be done for the four spheres just discussed. And I will return to Tainter and the collapse of complex societies tomorrow. Let's talk about collapse specifically with regard to Western economies and the United States in particular. And I'm going to read a piece here at AmericanMind.org from David P. Goldman, described as a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life and Deputy Editor and columnist at the Asia Times. He is the author, most recently, of You Will Be Assimilated, China's Plan to Sinoform the World. The piece is called Fatal Dependency. The United States has borrowed $18 trillion from foreigners since the great financial crisis of 2008, a staggering sum that is nearly equal to America's annual gross domestic product. The notion that the dollar's dominance in world finance might come to an end was a fringe view only 5 years ago, when America's net foreign investment position was a mere negative $8 trillion. Notably, the net international investment position fell by $6 trillion between 2019 and 2022. Roughly the amount of federal stimulus spent in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In a December 2021 report for the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life, I warned about the likely consequences of mounting U.S. deficits. Quote, the United States stock market now trades at nearly 30 times earnings, a multiple not seen since 2001, before a long and painful correction. The lofty valuation of the U.S. equity market is driven by the longest period of negative real interest rates in U.S. history. If the dollar's reserve status is compromised, the United States will no longer be able to borrow at negative real rates, and rising bond yields will put pressure on equity markets, depressing the value of the U.S. stock market and reducing the value of pension and retirement funds, unquote. Well, stocks are worth what they're worth, right? However, throughout most stocks throughout history, there has been some correlation to the state of the company and its stated worth in its stock market price. 30 times earnings. That is preposterous, of course, in an era of ZERP. Let's just take all this essentially free money and buy back our own stocks, thus forcing the price higher. I mean, what's the worst that could go wrong? But let's get back to Mr. Goldman. One used to read about the demise of dollar dominance in the newsletters of coin dealers and monetary cranks. Now we read such forecasts and research reports by Credit Suisse. The research department of Goldman Sachs, probably the most conventional of all commentators, warns that the dollar will go the way of the British pound, as unsustainable current account deficits lead to high U.S. inflation and substitution into other reserve currencies. Credit Suisse analyst Zoltan Pozsar wrote March 7th, "We are witnessing the birth of Bretton Woods to a new world monetary order centered around commodity-based currencies in the East that will likely weaken the euro-dollar system and also contribute to inflationary forces in the West. A crisis is unfolding, a crisis of commodities. Commodities are collateral, and collateral is money, and this crisis is about the rising allure of outside money over inside money. Bretton Woods, too, was built on inside money, and its foundations crumbled a week ago when the G7 seized Russia's foreign exchange reserves," unquote. Goldman comments, "Washington's seizure of Russian foreign exchange reserves seems risky given America's enormous and accelerating dependency on foreign borrowing. Paradoxically, America's strength lies in its weakness. A sudden end to the dollar's leading role in world finance would have devastating consequences for the U.S. economy, as well as the economies of its trading partners. In addition to the $18 trillion of net foreign investment in the U.S., foreigners keep about $16 trillion in United States dollars and overseas bank deposits to finance international transactions. That's $34 trillion of foreign financing against a U.S. GDP of not quite $23 trillion. Foreigners also have enormous exposure to the U.S. stock and real estate markets. No one, least of all China, with its $3 trillion in reserves, wants a run against the dollar and dollar assets. But the world's central banks are reducing dollar exposure cautiously but steadily. The trickle of diversification out of dollars could turn into a flood. What the International Monetary Fund March 2nd called the stealth erosion of dollar dominance presages a not-so-stealthy exit from the dollar. Like Nebuchadnezzar's handwriting on the wall, the king's soothsayers can read the message as plain as day. Notably, Russia's central bank cut the share of the U.S. dollar in its reserves from 21% a year ago to just 11% in January, while increasing its holdings in Chinese renminbi to 17%, up from 13% a year ago. Russia's central bank has also bought more gold than any other institution in recent years. With just 8% of world export volume versus China's 15%, the reserve role of the U.S. dollar no longer reflects American economic strength. It derives perversely from the rest of the world's desire to save. The people of the world's high-income countries are aging rapidly. In 2001, 28% of their population was aged 50 years or older. By 2040, the proportion will reach 45%. Aging populations save for retirement. The Germans and Japanese save nearly 30% of GDP, and the Chinese save 44%. America saves just 18% of GDP. For the past 15 years, American consumers have bought roughly $1 trillion more of goods each year than America exports. The import-led consumption boom and the availability of cheap electronics from China and other Asian exporters fed a digital entertainment boom that inflated the stock prices of Apple, Microsoft, Google, Meta, and other U.S. software companies. Foreigners then invested their earnings from exports in U.S. tech stocks, as well as government bonds, real estate, and other assets. The tech boom harmed the U.S. economy far more than it helped it, turning American teenagers into risk-averse recluses addicted to smartphones and social media while generating stock market valuations never before seen outside of classic economic history of bubbles. The biggest bubble in world financial history. When the COVID-19 pandemic threatened to collapse the bubble, the US government added $6 trillion in stimulus to the economy. That shot of adrenaline reinflated the tech bubble, which explains why the US net foreign investment position fell by another $6 trillion between 2019 and 2022. Overall, net imports of manufacturers rose from about $60 billion a month prior to the COVID pandemic to $100 billion a month as of February 2022. The bubble is so enormous that the entire world has a stake in it, and none of the world's major economies can extract themselves from it without significant damage. So, when Joe Biden or whoever is in charge of Joe Biden's brain or his pen decided to crush Russia with sanctions, did they ask the obvious question, what could go wrong? No, they don't ask questions like that anymore. Let's shut down society. Let's wreck the economy. Let's make everyone in America or Canada afraid of every other person in America or Canada. Did they ask the question, what's the worst that could happen? No, they didn't ask those questions. Because why would you ask questions like that? Are you some sort of dismal Dora or dismal Desmond? Again, I recommend this essay in AmericanMind.org called Fatal Dependency by David P. Goldman. So what are the facts on the ground? Well, here's a piece by Joel Kotkin at Spiked. The working classes are a volcano waiting to erupt, and talks about the French elections. Most voters in France or elsewhere are more concerned about soaring energy, food, and housing costs than gender fluidity, racial injustice, and climate, so-called climate catastrophe. Many suspect that the cognitive elites epitomized by President Emmanuel Macron lack even the ambition to improve their living conditions. The French elections reflect the essential political conflict of our time. On one side, there is a powerful alliance between the corporate oligarchy and the regulatory clerisy. On the other, there are two beleaguered and angry classes, the small business owners and artisans, and the vast, largely unorganized service class. The small business class generally tends to favor the populist right, whether in America, Australia, or Europe. These people want the government out of their business and to be left alone. Meanwhile, workers tend towards the populist left, which promises to relieve their economic pain. Then he describes how the traditional French political parties, they collapsed in the first round of the presidential election. Kotkin continues, we may, as de Tocqueville put it, during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, be sleeping on a volcano. A still inchoate rebellion from below against the concentration of wealth and power above seems to be gathering momentum. Across the 36 wealthier countries of the OECD, the richest citizens have taken an ever greater share of national GDP in recent years as the middle class has become smaller. Heavily in debt, mainly because of high housing costs, the middle class looks increasingly like a boat in rocky waters, suggests the OECD. One key indicator of the declining middle class is rates of home ownership, which are stagnant or plummeting, particularly among the young in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, well, also Canada. In the United States, the chance of middle class earners moving up to the top rungs of the earnings ladder has dropped by approximately 20% since the early 1980s. Life expectancy in the U.S. has dropped to the lowest levels in a quarter of a century. This glowing class division is a global phenomenon. In 1974, the proportion of global corporate income that went to labor was about 64%. It dropped to 59% by 2012. This pattern is applied not only to wealthy markets in the West, but also to labor-rich markets such as China, India, and Mexico. In 2017, the Pew Research Center found that poll respondents in France, Britain, Spain, Italy, and Germany are even more pessimistic about the next generation than those in the United States. This erosion of opportunity sets the stage for a potential combustion of class anger, particularly as the pandemic and now Russia's invasion threaten to make things worse. The unemployment rate reached 32.5% in South Africa during the pandemic years, with almost two-thirds of young people with no job in sight. The story is unfortunately similar elsewhere in Africa, with regional powers such as Kenya and Senegal reporting over 40% unemployment. This is a recipe for chaos. Several Latin American, African, and Middle Eastern countries have also defaulted on long-term loans, and many more may follow. Even China seems poised for an outbreak of class warfare. Since 1978, China's Gini coefficient, a key measurement of income equality, has tripled. China's class divisions have grown so intense that President Xi has been forced to respond with a promised drive to spread the wealth and cut the oligarchy down to size. As it was during the Industrial Revolution, today there are key divisions within society between what economist Thomas Piketty refers to as the merchant right, largely the analog economy, and the Brahmin left of large corporations and investors. In the US, this latter group generally backs the Democrats and the environmental and cultural agenda of the progressive left. In contrast, the traditional middle class, comprised of skilled workers, Main Street business people, and small property owners, has become the bulwark of the Trumpian Republican Party. Similar patterns can be seen in Australia, Canada, and the UK, as left parties have all become dominated by highly educated professionals, though they have also cultivated constituencies of the destitute. Yes, the high-low alliance, a long historical favorite. The strategy has limits and may not even appeal to the young in the long term. Biden has already lost his majority among young voters, which means that he's finished, barring a miracle. Many of Europe's right-wing nationalist parties are led by millennials. These parties appear generally on the rise in an inflation-rattled, increasingly pessimistic continent. Voters' anger can sometimes be expressed in crude, even racist terms, but it reflects real economic distress made worse by COVID and now the Russian war, stoking inflation to the highest level in 40 years. In the UK, where incomes have dropped more than at any time in at least 30 years, so-called non-essential shops faced long periods of closure during the pandemic. With the ascendancy of on-time retailers, many have since closed their doors permanently. In Germany, the self-employed were 4 times more likely to suffer income losses than their wage-earning counterparts during the pandemic. In the US, roughly 110,000 restaurants shut down during the lockdowns, and some 200,000 more businesses overall disappeared compared to the usual erosion. Stoking class resentment, the pandemic clearly favored big companies, which could deploy far greater resources to make the necessary transition to the new reality. Big pharma companies have pulled in lucrative profits with vaccine revenue. CEO compensation reached record levels this year. Investment bankers on Wall Street enjoyed record bonuses, and the giant tech firms now boast a market capitalization greater than the bloated U.S. federal budget. There is much more of the same here. What does it lead to? The first signs of class unrest are already evident. The beleaguered working and middle classes are taking to the streets, as seen with the Canadian truckers or the Gilets jaunes movement in France. There are not a lot of red flags at these demonstrations, which are attended mainly by suburban and exurban independent workers, contractors, artisans, and delivery people who work for themselves. These people may have looked to socialists once, but many have now planted themselves firmly on the right. Yes. But the question is, James Byrne wrote in The Machiavellians that in the absence of an alternative elite, the collapse of the competence of the elite traditionally leads to very bad things indeed, such as revolts or revolutions. Do you think that, well, obviously our elites are worried about that, which is why they're engaged in this war against free speech. Oh, someone's saying that Trudeau is a traitor, or, Trudeau must go. Oh, well, you got to keep government eye on these people. Yes, these people who sound tough on Twitter, they're a real threat, right? This is from Roberta Wakewell Cruz at the Post-Millennial. 53% of Canadians just $200 away from insolvency. 31% can't pay their bills. This was a survey of 2,000 Canadians conducted between March 9th and 15th, taking place just a week before the Bank of Canada raised its policy rate in a vain effort to curb inflation. Yes, of course, Canadian media would have you believe that the Canadian economy is just going gangbusters. And you know who's to blame? Of course, Biden is saying the same thing. You know who's to blame for that pesky inflation? Putin. Yeah, everything bad that happens in the world, it's the Russians' fault. A quarter of Canadians say they've taken on more debt because of the pandemic. This includes using credit cards, 14%, line of credit, 7%, taking out a bank loan, 3%, or deferring mortgage payments, 3%. 1 in 5, 20% is also reported raiding their emergency savings to pay their bills. What happens when these people run out of money? What happens when they lose their homes? Do you think our leaders are worried about that? They're not worried about the specifics of this because it's their own fault. These people should have chosen richer parents. A rather daring piece by Joanna Williamson spiked Rishi Sunak, citizen of nowhere. He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer for the United Kingdom. And we've learned some embarrassing things about him and his family. We now know that the Chancellor's wife, Akshata Murthy, is the daughter of an Indian tech billionaire. Her own stake in her father's company, Infosys, generates millions of pounds each year, making Murthy richer than the Queen, apparently. We also learned recently that she has non-dom status, meaning she has not paid UK tax on income generated abroad. Questions have also been raised about the money Rishi holds in a blind trust, which is believed to be linked to his time as a hedge fund manager. Prior to these revelations, we already knew that the Sunaks were fabulously wealthy. And the author of this piece says that she is not an envious person. However, there is a problem. What does rankle is when rich people don't afford the rest of us the same disinterest when they tell us not only how to live our lives, but also seem hell-bent on making us poorer. What's more, Rishi has responded poorly to legitimate questions about the various revelations. Of course, it is not anti-feminist to ask questions of the Chancellor's wife, a billionaire, non-domiciled resident of Downing Street. And, it turns out that there's something else going on with this fellow. There is another reason the Sunak's financial arrangements matter. They reveal that despite the vote for Brexit signaling the importance of national sovereignty, we are still governed by an elite that eschews any attachment to the nation. Members of Britain's political class have far more in common with wealthy, powerful individuals, whether from California, New York, or London, than they do with their own constituents. One might call these people rootless cosmopolites. That's not her. She wouldn't say that, but I'm saying it. What has been most galling from the revelations of the past week is less Akshata Murthy's non-dom status than the fact that the couple kept U.S. green cards, granting them the status of permanent residents of the U.S. Green card holders are expected to make a legal commitment to make the U.S. a so-called permanent home. Rishi held a green card until October 2021, for more than a year into his role in the second most powerful position in the UK government. Sunak's green card shows that his personal arrangements were not simply a financial matter. For Sunak, home doesn't seem to be his North Yorkshire constituency, not even the UK, but California. And the Chancellor is not the only one. Of course, Health Secretary Sajid Javid has declared that he was registered as a non-dom while working as an international banker, and there are plenty of Labour MPs who prefer life among the Euro elite than with their British neighbours. Yes, it's not so much that these people are fabulously rich, but they don't give a toss about everyone else. Again, they increasingly seem to despise people who are not like them. And I can't see this ending well. And, I don't think we'll talk about that today. And I don't think I'm going to, I'll save discussion of Canada till tomorrow. The fact that there is no free speech in Canada anymore. This was abolished by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1989 in a case that nobody talks about in my country because reporters or journalists, as we're supposed to call them now, are both lazy and stupid. They're also mendacious into the bargain. Let's have a final look at the chat. Hello, British American, who says the only upside of complete economic, social, and civilizational collapse will be the reversion to medieval style justice. Think mobs with pitchforks, hastily erected scaffolds, and short drop hanging. Yeah, okay. It's easy enough to say that. Not so long ago, I reviewed Anthony Burgess's book, The Wanting Seed, which shows just such a collapse, complete collapse, a worldwide collapse, leading to terrible, terrible, terrible scenes and a devolution to, well, war for the sake of it, just slaughtering your own people and pretending that they're fighting someone else, and cannibalism. Palcasso 88 says, my movie range is the 40s to 2000. Lots of great movies from the 1980s and 1990s. Well, I'll mention this again. How many movies made, say, after the year 2000 does anyone quote? Or does anyone say, hey, you remember that great scene when this happened? Or that great scene where, this funny scene where that happened? Palcasso 88 says, The Shield turns 20 this year. The Z-Man had a post on Subscribestar about how it could never be made today. Too honest. Yes. The Shield was quite realistic in, who are the type of people who, end up interacting with the police. Gangs. There's a lot of gangs there, and they are almost always ethnically based. The Shield was difficult to watch. You're right, British American. I think I mentioned previously that I got the first season on DVD years ago, and I watched it, and then I decided to go whole hog to get all 7 seasons in a box from Britain. And I watched, seasons 2 to 7, in that way that people do now, apparently. Pretty much, okay, I'm going to watch as many of these as I can in a day. And I don't know, it took, a week or two. And after The Shield was over, I was afraid to leave my apartment for about a week. Don Willis says, may your evening be peaceful and quiet. Thanks for the stream. Well, you're too kind. Too kind. What else do we have here? The future looks very bleak. I find comfort in old movies, says Palcasso 88. I don't know. I'm tempted to use the words of the famous labor organizer, leader of a radical labor movement called the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World. And he was a Swede called Josef Hillstrom, but he called him Joe Hill. Allegedly, his dying words were, don't mourn, organize. For all books are divisible into 2 classes, the books of the hour and the books of all time. John Ruskin, that's from Paula Berlinski. Thank you for that. Hello, Professor Paul. Can his death be confirmed conclusively now? Well, as of about an hour ago, I couldn't confirm it. Beware of the legal fiction known as implied consent, says Paula Berlinski. All right. RT and Pravda have had something to say about this. Can't confirm, says Chokokin 666. Magnolia is crap, but the cruise stuff was great, says Picasso 88. I did like the cruise stuff in there. However, there's so much in that movie which is just rubbish. One of the characters goes to a drugstore and she's ordering, like enough intoxicants to lay waste to entire frat for a year. And so the guy behind the counter is asking her stuff and she becomes furious. And I thought, does this director know what country this is set in, where your privacy is everyone's business? Or there is an actual plague of frogs in Magnolia. Frogs, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands are falling from the sky. Oh, that's interesting. Characters go, plague of frogs. If that happened in real life, there would be many, many people driving to the nearest liquor store and holding out their bank card and saying, I have this much money. How much whiskey will this buy? Oh, yeah, plague of frogs. Yes. 6 actors in search of an Oscar. Palpicasso 88. That's a good one. Hello to Tarot Destroyer. And okay. I'm going to wrap it up. I am going to wrap it up with Christian Slater. Is that what we're talking about? Okay. No, that's it. Oh, finally, we're talking about movies. Anran says, I was watching Somewhat True Romance the other day. Tarantino was a nut, but there's some very funny stuff in that movie. Vulgar, but still funny. Saul Rubinek is hysterical as the studio exec. He's Canadian, as Canadians always say. He's Canadian, That's how you can distinguish a Canadian in a room. And he's had a long career, and he was in the latest, I guess the last Coen brothers film, the Scruggs film, which I greatly enjoyed. I am going to be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to make a donation to this live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And if you are in Canada, donations may be made to the live stream directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.